So I'd like to invite the panelists to join me on stage. So first we have Lisa Corbius. She is the head of secretariat at the UN Joint SDG Fund. Welcome. We have Karen Sack. She's executive director at the ORRAA. Welcome. We have Keith Lawrence. He's project director conservation support at the Pew Charitable Trust. And last but not least, we have Karine Meeson. She is head of division water management and blue economy at the Projects Directorate at the European Investment Bank. Welcome, and great to have you with us. So yeah, this conversation is really about closing that finance gap that we mentioned. I mean, the opportunity that we mentioned is enormous, but how do we actually close that gap? So we're going to structure this conversation roughly in terms of what are these organizations doing that we have represented, which are amazing in terms of representing the whole spectrum of blue finance. So what are they doing in terms of unlocking that funding, but also what are the kind of new innovative tools to de-risk investment? Because as we said before, there is this blue finance opportunity, but how do we de-risk investment? And also we're going to talk about some of the partnerships, and we are already in a way a partnership here. We're all coming together to discuss these issues, but how do we build more partnerships in that space? How do we create an enabling environment for unlocking this finance? So let's get started in terms of what the organizations that we have represented here are doing to close the finance gap. So I'd actually like to start with Lisa in terms of, you have more than 20 years of experience in international development, and you work at the UN Joint SDG Fund, and that obviously means you're at the forefront of implementing innovative financing projects. So in terms of, I'd just like to find out from you what your organization is actually doing to reduce the finance gap for the ocean economy.
Thank you, Martin. I'm delighted to be here and representing the United Nations. The Joint SDG Fund was created by the UN General Assembly, recognizing this trillion-dollar financing gap for the SDGs, not just SDG14, but as you well pointed out, the way that all of the SDGs really rely on one another or are dependent on one another. And it was really intended to meet this gap by taking all the generous public money that your tax dollars may or may not trickle into the UN system and blend it with private financing. So we're the equivalent of a startup impact fund within the UN family. And so that $50 billion a year spend on the development system, the UNICEFs, the World Food Programs, the World Health Organization, all the different partners that you may know, there's over 40 agencies, funds, and programs. We work through and with all of them to really attract the private financing, and in this particular case, for some of the work focused on ocean-facing communities, ocean and blue economies.
Great, amazing. And yeah, working with those different agencies and bringing this together, this kind of coordination is absolutely vital. So that's absolutely great that you're doing that. Karen, I use the abbreviation of your organization because you're, sometimes it's quite a mouthful. The Ocean Risk and Resilience Action Alliance. It's a great name, and it's also a very impactful organization. And obviously, you lead that organization and focusing on driving investment into coastal and ocean natural capital. So just briefly, could you explain in terms of what your organization does to mobilize ocean finance?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Martin. It's lovely to be here. Happy to have it called AURA. It is a mouthful. The Ocean Risk Alliance is an alliance now of over 70 organizations. We work across sectors to help translate and connect dots across those sectors. So we've got government members, multilateral organizations, private sector, particularly insurance and finance. Our lead banking partner, as you can see at the back of the room, is Deutsche Bank, and our lead insurance partner is AXA. We have NGOs, including Pew, that is a member of the alliance, and we work with also multilateral organizations. And what we try and do is both translate some of the ideas, just listening to the session before, around how we can grow the pipeline from the ground up, thinking about the missing middle, and then also from the top down, the type of global ocean financing ecosystem that needs to be developed, and bring these different groups together so we can propel forward at pace and at speed to drive investment into the space. Yeah,
that makes sense, Karen. I mean, you mentioned the missing middle, which is absolutely vital here, because often we have a lot of interest from small-scale organizations. We have the startup conversation earlier, which is really important. But it is, and there's also the large players, but it is that missing middle, and actually unlocking that opportunity is vital. That's brilliant. Keith, I'd also like to ask you in terms of, you lead a team at Pew, looking at conservation, finance, climate mitigation, adaptation, but also economic approaches to conservation. So how is your organization helping to unlock blue finance?
Thanks, Martin. Great to be here. So yes, Pew Charitable Trust is indeed a non-profit, and happy to be a member of Aura as well, and all the great work that you do. We have a really pretty diverse portfolio of environmental work, ranging from marine protected areas and fisheries management to climate mitigation and resilience, reducing plastic pollution. But I wanted to give a few examples of financing work that we're doing in the coastal wetland space to start with. So we work on, both in the US and internationally across the developing world, on mangroves, seagrass, and salt marsh projects of a variety of kinds. And so just a few examples of the kinds of financing things that we're trying to do to create resources to fund that work. Is in Oregon State in the United States. We have work on developing a coastal resilience bond there, which would be the first of its kind, I believe. In the Seychelles, all the way across the world, we're working with SECAT, which is a local organization there, to figure out what solutions might look like for financing seagrass in that country, which is an overlooked ecosystem, I think, a lot of the time. In Costa Rica, we're partnering with, supporting really, the government of Costa Rica and their process to hopefully create a new payment for ecosystem services program for mangroves, which would run in parallel to the existing one, terrestrial forests, that a lot of you will be aware of. And that's very community-based, and community engagement is a real sort of core principle there, as it is in a lot of our work. Also in Belize as well, where we have some work on coastal wetlands too. So it can take a variety of different forms and different financial tools in different places. But yeah, we're busy. Amazing.
Well, it sounds great. I mean, in terms of community resilience, but also, the work on natural capital that you do in terms of seagrass and mangroves. That's, something we discussed earlier as well in terms of, the importance of highlighting the value of those ecosystems and building resilience for these ecosystems. Corinne, you lead a team responsible for appraisal and monitoring of blue economy projects at the EIB. So could you tell us briefly how the EIB helps to unlock blue finance?
Yes. First, thanks for having us. Very happy to be here in person this year. So the European Investment Bank is a public bank owned by the 27 member states of the European Union. And as a bank, one of our main activity, of course, is to lend money. But as a public bank, we give a lot of importance to advisory as well, to make sure that we can finance bankable projects. We believe a lot in partnerships as well, and I think we'll come back to that later. We've set up different initiatives to support blue economy. The two main ones are the Clean Oceans Initiative and the Blue Sustainable Oceans Strategy. But we've also supported the marine energy for a while. I'll come back to this later. And our strength, I think, is that we can provide a diverse range of financing products because, as you said, the blue economy, in fact, encompasses a lot of different activities with different needs in the financing sector.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. Yeah, that diverse range of products and offerings is so vital because often, people just think, yeah, maybe I've heard of blue bonds, that's kind of, sovereign bonds and so on. But actually, the fact that you offer these kind of diverse range of instruments is absolutely vital. And also the fact that you mentioned the need for these bankable projects. That's crucial. I'd like to, now move on to discuss a little bit about these kind of innovative tools that we need to de-risk investment, and particularly at the scale and speed that is required. So, Corinne, just as a follow-up from what you mentioned in terms of what the EIB does, I mean, you offer this kind of variety of financing products that you mentioned. So what kind of financial innovations have you recently encountered that the audience should really know about that is really exciting in this space?
I think probably the most exciting is that we've supported offshore wind farms since the very beginning, so in now more than 20 years ago, and we've probably finance 1/3 of them in the EU. So now this seems almost normal to finance this type of project. But when we started 20 years ago, in fact, there were a lot of risk associated to that. The fact that a public bank can intervene, look at the project, we have bankers, of course, but we also have technical teams embedded in the company, so that there's a thorough due diligence with experts looking at the project. So, and we also call us the crowd-in bank because, of course, we never provide the financing alone. So it's a signal that we can give to other commercial banks or to the market that these projects that we finance are sustainable and a good project. So offshore wind farms, of course, 20 years ago. More recently, floating offshore. So we had a project in Portugal and last year in France, pilot project in the southwestern part of France. And these are projects, of course, that we would like to see more of in the future.
Amazing. Well, it's really good to see. I mean, obviously, having that experience in offshore wind that you can then apply to more, even more innovative approaches on floating is one example. Keith, I mean, obviously through your work at Pew, you regularly work on innovative financing projects. You mentioned some of those examples as well, involving public, private, but also kind of blended source of finance. So could you tell us a bit more about these kind of financial innovations that you have encountered and that could be of interest for the wider audience in terms of blue finance?
Sure, delighted to. I mean, I can talk about another big partnership and initiative that we are part of, which is called Enduring Earth. It is a very large and ambitious initiative together with WWF, the Nature Conservancy, and a group called Zoma Labs that is scaling up and deploying project financing for permanence deals around the world. If you're not familiar with that term, it's basically an opportunity to bring together different types of financing in a single close, layer on political and community commitments from the outset in pursuit of really durable outcomes that will stand the test of time, both financially durable but also politically durable and with communities at the center. So that partnership is aiming to mobilize $4 billion to work in 20 countries and 500 million hectares of protected areas, both terrestrial and ocean. So some of this will be terrestrial conservation, some of it will be marine. And I think that deal, that structure, what I really like about it is that durability. It's the fact that it has the political and the community piece baked in as well as having the financial commitments. And one thing that I think is a little bit lacking so far is that most of the deals that have been done so far, there have been deals in Bhutan, Costa Rica, the Amazon, Colombia, I'm missing one or two. But most of the deals that have been done so far have had philanthropy and government funding as their sort of core funding deals. We're working in one in Canada that will have a lot of government funding behind it too. What they haven't done so much is layer in private financing and more sort of innovative financing structures within that structure. I think there's a huge opportunity because of that certainty, that political will that underpins it and so on. So we're really looking for ways to expand that model and find new sources of revenues within that structure.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks a lot, Keith. And that's great that you bring together these different players. I mean, as you said, it's about the community and bringing private money into this, where there's already interest from philanthropy and government. That's actually absolutely vital, and that's great to hear about Enduring Earth. Karen, I mean, obviously you have a focus on risk and insurance. I mean, but what kind of innovative financing tools and solutions have you recently seen, and to really help to unlock the blue investment opportunity that we said, but also keeping in mind the need for scale and speed as well to really meet our 2030 targets?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things here. One is to think about this discussion from two different hemispheres, the South and the North. And there actually is, we talk about there being a lot of potential finance on the table in the North. It is much more difficult in the Global South to activate that funding, and in particular to build the cohort, the community of practice around a sustainable blue economy, both for the governments in the Global South, so the small island developing states and least developed countries, as well as entrepreneurs. And we're seeing the evolution of blue bonds in the space. Hopefully that will speed up. But there have to be projects, those investable projects that can feed the pipeline. When we started working on this, there were about 5 products, finance or insurance products that we could identify. We now have about 45 products in our pipeline, and many of them are very small. So just talking from the bottom up, but the opportunities to really scale. One of them, which I'm actually really excited to announce here today, is we've just worked with some of our partners, Synchronicity Earth, which is an NGO, and Aurum Finance, which is a hedge fund investment specialist, and they have set up an expendable endowment so that donors, instead of following the traditional philanthropic model of $1 in, $1 out, can actually invest in the endowment. It'll pay out around 15% per year, and the focus of the investments are on very small projects in developing countries that deliver impact over the long term. So can we save a species of sawfish in Bangladesh? If that's only going to cost $25,000 a year, can we finance that for 3 years so there's sustainable financing for that small project? So as much as we need the very big projects, we've also got to keep communities intact and do those. And that fund already has $500,000 in it as a result of people just being interested in seeing their philanthropy go that one step further. So that's bringing in philanthropy and NGO and a hedge fund investor. Then looking at, on the insurance side of things, some amazing products that are in development, from micro-insurance for small-scale fishers. People may not care very much about small-scale fishers, but there are over 100 million around the world, and they are highly vulnerable to risk. If they get displaced and have to migrate to cities, there are food security issues, there are migration and displacement issues. So how can we work to keep those communities intact? So our partners, Rare, Abelobi, and others working around the world are looking at how they can create financial products for them. And Rare has been working in the Philippines to provide livelihood interruption insurance for small-scale fishers. And tacked onto that is good behavior. So you can get that insurance if you're fishing in a sustainable way without destructive gear, which is, has the potential to scale globally. And then finally, looking at the macro insurance field and the coral reef parametric insurance models that have been developed in the Mesoamerican reef. We saw the first payout happen last November when Hurricane Lisa hit Belize. There was a payout within 14 days of $175,000, which went into the community to the workers who no longer had jobs, right, because the tourists weren't coming, who had been trained as reef defenders to get into the water, clear the debris off the reef. By clearing the debris off the reef, the ongoing wave action that is taking that debris back and forth is removed, and the reef can recover more quickly. And there's payment for those folks. That parametric measure is now being expanded across the Mesoamerican reef into the Caribbean, and we're looking in places like Costa Rica and Colombia as well at other triggers like wastewater for parametric payouts. So really exciting things, all of which have the ability to replicate and scale.
Amazing, Karen. I mean, that's great to hear. Also, you mentioned microfinance and micro insurance, macro insurance. So it's basically on both ends. You have new solutions, and the fact that you mentioned that from 5 products to 45 products, that's really a sign that there is innovation happening. It's not just about the the number of products available, but it's also the innovation in it, as you mentioned, parametric insurance and so on, and also scalability, as you mentioned. These are examples that can be scaled around the world. That's really great to see. Lisa, obviously implementing innovative financing projects is at the heart of what you do at the UN Joint SDG Fund. So do you also have some examples of these new innovations that could inspire our audience?
No, and really picking up on points around local communities and the impact. All of our investing is rooted in human rights. We are the United Nations. We're going into this as a convener and a broker to try to really ensure that government priorities are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, and then investors are then given the guarantee, so to speak, of partnering with the UN and us on the ground. So I think, looking at blue bonds, looking at the growth of this sector, what we are trying to do is be the first loss into any of these kinds of programs in partnership with government, so that any investor looking at Cape Verde, it's the first sustainable financing platform, it's called Blue X, and it's a way of Cape Verde entering the capital markets, which would not have been done, I don't believe, without UN backing and possibly that funding. And so That platform, okay, 26 million, you might say, so what? Well, in Cape Verde, 26 million for small and medium enterprises is a huge historical moment. Just like in Fiji, an $80 million coral reef investment is quite historical for the island of Suva. Now, again, trying to then bundle these together so that we can get the attention of, I think you mentioned your friends from Deutsche Bank, would love to meet you at the coffee, but how do we then attract the sincere asset managers who don't even meet with us for anything less than 500 million? So, our challenge is we're coming up with projects that are not, a $1 billion hydrogen plant. They're a coastal rehabilitation program for those fisher families that you mentioned, and how do we become the glue? What we help to do, of course, because we have boots on the ground in 150 countries, is that we can help vet, we can help train, we can help build the enabling environment of those small and medium enterprises so that they can receive funding, because often there's a missing middle even after you find the middle. Then you have to get it down literally into the fisherman's hands, right, so that he or she can make the difference. So the concessional loans, we're delighted to be exploring opportunities with the EIB and other DFIs. Part of the game is for the UN to enter with that first loss and then try to build a platform out that aligns. In Papua New Guinea, we work a lot in the small island developing states by nature of them being most impacted by this vulnerability. An incubation facility specifically focused on biodiversity. Again, how to really encourage early stage investments in small and medium enterprises that can respond to these challenges. So it's really community focused. It's always human rights based. We always look for women to be in charge. Look at this panel. Well done, Martin. Looking for ways to really break through some of what has always been inhibitions to investing in the developing world, and then really accelerate from there.
Yeah, great. That makes sense, Lisa. I mean, you mentioned that, going in and bringing that credibility with the UN and then building around that and bringing others on board and taking that first loss, but then it's actually really a gain for everyone because that creates the momentum and the credibility and that incubation opportunity. And you mentioned the capacity building as well that you can provide is absolutely vital. So it's not just the money being there, the great innovation being there, but it's that capacity building with the community. Amazing. So at this stage, I'd like to ask if there are any questions from the audience for the panel. I also have a couple of questions here from the slide. Also, keep sending them in. Are there any questions? There's one in the front here. Please state your name and affiliation, and keep your question brief, please.
Hi, hello, good afternoon. My name is Nícia Ruda from Lisbon Essential Business Magazine. I would like to ask Mrs. Lisa to give a little bit more details about the Cabo Verde project, please.
Thank you very much. Yes, Lisa?
Yeah. So the United Nations, with the Stock Exchange of Cape Verde, created a sustainable financing platform, and they called it Blue X. And their goal was to really raise the funding in capital markets that was unavailable previously for investors in the country. And with the Investment Bank of Cape Verde, so with the government national bank, they issued their first blue bond, which also was focused specifically on micro-entrepreneurs, startups in the coastal communities. So this was very much investing in the fisheries sector, the maritime sector, and as they're developing the blue bond, they're also looking at direct impacts in the local communities. So each of these investments is structured in a way that adheres to the blue economy priorities of the government, but also blue bond principles that are now luckily globally endorsed. And then there's a third-party external review that is actually completed by Ernst & Young. So you can see there's a wide array of stakeholders involved. And actually this afternoon, I believe there's a panel featuring government colleagues, I don't know if there's any in the room, from Cape Verde and their stock exchange. So we'd love for you to also come and listen to an example in the making that's also here.
Yeah, amazing. That's a great practical example. Any additional questions? There's a question there.
Hello. Okay, I got a mic here behind you. I'll pass the mic after. What's to the lady who manages the mic? I'm Martin. I am the founder and partner at Happy Homes Ventures. Good to see you again, Karen. So my question is, one thing you mentioned in the beginning, Martin, was that what's lacking is bankable projects. And my question is, what if it isn't bankable projects that's lacking, but what if there is a missing in the definition of what bankable project is, and what is that missing in the definition of what bankable projects are?
Mm-hmm. Okay, great question. Yeah, thanks a lot. That's a really good question. Who would like to tackle that one? Karen?
I can take it. Hi there. Nice to see you again. I think it's a really good question, and I think there's often a convenient ennui, in a way, in the space, where we hear from the private sector that we need bankable projects. We hear from folks on the ground that there are lots of projects, and yet nobody is willing to put those two things together. And so I think part of this is redefining what is bankable, and that's where we've got to think about the radical collaborations that we've got to bring to the table, so that we can put different partners together. We can think about how we blend some of the finance together so we can de-risk the investments, so that the private sector can come to the table and not say that those projects aren't investable because there are guarantees behind them. We can look at some of the insurance tools that need to come in as well. And I think we're actually working on talking to this missing middle piece and those bankable projects. There's also this gap in our space between the projects that could be eligible for philanthropy or ODA funding, kind of up to $400,000, and then the kind of 500,000 or to 5 million, and then above that. And so we're actually working with some partners on developing what we call the Outrigger Ocean Impact Fund, and it's precisely focused on that space and seeing how we can grow that project pipeline, and we will need to build into that some guarantees and some de-risking mechanisms so that we can encourage the private sector to come into that space, and hopefully in doing that they can see the benefits in the space and then really kind of go wild and put more money on the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point around de-risking the guarantees. That's part of the definition, but it's a great question as well. There was one more question here, I think, yes, over there.
Hello. Well, my name is Patrick Hallquist. I'm from a company called 2050 Now. We're in research and development, especially in algae business. And one of our biggest issues is the regulatory landscape. We have so many different countries that have absolutely no idea in the public sector, even what algae are in some points of time. And it comes to a point that we don't really know how to invest in this or who is investing in this, because if that's going to come from the private sector, they're going to run away immediately, right? So is there anything that the United Nations or other multinational investment banks are doing with regards to that, or trying to build a global strategy for that? Because things that work up north will never work down south, but at the same time, the importance, I mean, it's not a question of solving issues over here and then solving them down south. So I want some clarity on regards to that, because it's always a question that comes up, and that can last 30 years before something really happens.
Yeah, great question around the regulatory landscape and how that can be facilitated. Would you like, I know that the EIB, you're focusing a lot on developing policy and the financial frameworks, right?
Yeah, I can say, it will only answer part of your question, but when we started working in the blue economy field, in fact, we partnered very quickly with WWF and the European Commission to develop the Sustainable Blue Economy Financing Principles, which was, and which still is, the first step actually to define what is a sustainable investment in the blue economy field. Because we believe that it's very important to guide indeed the investors in this respect. Of course, it only answers partly your question, because in the countries and overall we also need this framework in place. But it was the first step that we could add with our partners.
Yeah, great points. Anyone else would like to? Yes.
Yeah,
please.
maybe I don't think I have all the answers to your question in detail, to be honest, but I think the broader question of how does policy and regulatory frameworks link to finance is a really interesting space. My organization, Pew, is probably a policy shop first and foremost, actually. We're research and policy centric, and finance has sort of come in a little later for us. and just thinking about how can we work with governments to create regulatory frameworks that encourage sustainability, that encourage enterprise and entrepreneurship at the same time is again, I think it's really interesting. And just to give an example, I mentioned earlier we were working on plastics. We've worked quite a bit on various policy mechanisms on plastic pollution around the world, both multilaterally and within a few individual countries. But we're also partnering with CDP, Minderoo, and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to create a new disclosure and reporting system for companies to report their plastics footprint, building off of the existing ones that already have, or that CDP already run for carbon, and they also have water and wood in there as well. So we're hoping that's going to become a new platform that will give more transparency to the plastic in the private sector. But it doesn't come without the regulatory push and pull as well. I think the two things are going to sort of come at the same time. So we're really interested in how investors can be part of that discussion as well, and investor pressure on companies can be part of the solution there too. So yeah, I don't think I'm quite answering your question, but I think that kind of nexus of investors, private sector, and regulation is really interesting.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yes, yeah, Lisa.
No, excellent questions. You know, a large part of what the UN does every day with governments is try to anticipate the roadblocks to development that policy or legislative gaps present. That's literally what we do when we're based at country, inside ministries every day. And we, the fund, as an avenue of financing and targeting of financing through the entire UN system, have been working in 70 countries on integrated national financing frameworks. And it's to your point around who's looking for the public-private partnership piece that you may be looking for to enter into the country. Who's looking at the capital gains tax? Who's looking at all these different ways that you, potentially as investors, need to find easily online, because someone's doing a paper for you, a feasibility study, you've already outsourced that to make sure it's even worth exploring further. So that's something the UN's trying to do. I mean, I'll give you a very practical example. Timor-Leste, you know, it's a petroleum-producing island, right, over in the Pacific. You know, they're trying to transition into clean energy. How do they understand how to even begin to develop that legislative framework for investments into ocean credits, into blue economy? And that's something the UN is trying to build with them now. And we start with catalytic funding. We start with, you know, what we call, you know, integrated policy frameworks, because we don't want it to only be one ministry. We want it to be across the sectors that will benefit all the people. But it's a huge amount of work, and I think dialogues like this that kind of say, oh, by the way, if only I had A, B, and C. I always ask this on every pitch call. I hope I pitch every one of you before I leave. What do you need from the UN to consider doing this? What would you need? And I think that's the conversation that my panelists are also helping answer, right? Like, what would we need to make this a bankable project? And looks like Karen's got 15%. I don't go above 6, but okay, I'm the UN, so you don't expect more than 6 from the UN. But the point is, what do you need, and how do we meet each other in the middle?
Yeah, that makes sense, and that goes to the heart of this collaborative effort. You mentioned integrated policy frameworks, so it's about looking at this beyond your own kind of silo and finding the right partners, but also, you know, a needs-based approach is very much desirable. There were a couple of questions here as well in terms of from the slide on. Please send questions via Slido as well. We don't want to ignore those. One is, what role do you see for the non-financial private sector in terms of financing these projects?
I'll attempt to answer that. I think this is where we've got to look at what we're trying to achieve here. And what we're trying to achieve goes back to what your introductory remarks were, Martin, in terms of tackling the climate, the biodiversity, and the pollution crises. So if you're a non-financial private sector actor, how is your supply chain adhering to 1.5 and meeting the Paris targets? How are you looking at your activities in terms of being biodiversity positive in their outcomes? And how are you working in a responsible manner with kind of, if you're in the travel sector, destination stewardship, or you know, looking at the community in which you are operating to make sure that you are not leaving behind a larger footprint than there was before. I think the other key thing is looking at the investments of the corporate that you're working with. And it was really quite interesting at a finance forum recently, a very large asset manager was talking about how they couldn't determine what was a biodiversity positive investment because they didn't have the metrics. And someone asked the question, well, did you have all the metrics before you invested in fossil fuels? To which they kind of couldn't answer. And so this is, I think, a key thing for the business sector to think about, is we don't need all the metrics. We have a clear path in terms of what's necessary. And if there are things that need to be stopped in terms of what is being done, that action and the transition away from those need to be invested into in a positive way to shift towards biodiversity positive and climate positive investments.
Yeah, great points. And as you said, we actually know from the science we already have, we know what we need to do. And that value chain approach can really help us and can actually involve any company, whether you have a direct connection with the ocean or not, to get involved and help. There's also a question around government policy in terms of, what can government policies do? And this is particular about Portugal. Obviously, we don't have a Portuguese government representative or Portuguese representative here, but how can government policies help to accelerate the blue economy? What are the best opportunities in terms of what the governments can do? Yes,
well, I have a great example from Portugal because they just did a debt swap for investing in climate with Cape Verde. So again, plugging the panel this afternoon, but I think, governments have a tremendous opportunity for leadership in this area and to really, as the whole MDB transition and discussion is approaching in the April meetings in DC and the IMF and World Bank, what are we really saying when we talk about blended finance? What are we talking when we say debt swaps? I've been approached now more and more about SDG swaps. So we've called them climate swaps, debt swaps. Well, which SDG would this debt be attributed to, and how can governments really work together? I think it's really a very promising space that I think there's a lot more political openness to than there was maybe a few years ago. COP27 set that light, right, with the loss and damage conversations, which are evolving now as we lead up to COP28. So I think a lot of us as global citizens, we probably need to vote accordingly to ensure that our governments do support that kind of exploratory investment and change.
Yeah, makes sense.
I think in the EU as well, we have all the EU directives when it comes to protection of water, for example, or the waste directive, etc. And I think it's very important for the governments to transpose the directive as soon as possible, and in other aspects to take more ambitious regulations, protections of the oceans or transpositions of the directives, and because it gives a signal and it sets the tone on what the governments want to achieve, and this is very important.
Yeah, that makes sense. And having that kind of common approach is absolutely vital. Just looking at the time, and also there's one question here that in a way could be woven into kind of almost like a closing statement from everyone. Well, obviously, this is relevant here because it's what is your take on why SDG14 received the lowest impact investment of all SDGs? Given that we have all these opportunities we just talked about, given the excitement around all these new products, impact funds, why is it that SDG14 is still so underinvested? Who would like to make a start?
I'll have a go. I'm not sure I totally know the answer. I think there's multiple answers to that, right? I think one of them is the kind of out of sight, out of mind thing about the ocean, right? It's sort of, it's not in people's front of mind. It's not something that you think about every day necessarily. And so I think it sometimes gets forgotten about. Even within the conservation community, the ocean gets less than its fair share probably of the available funding out there. Another one comes back to the bankability question that you spoke so eloquently about earlier, Karen, and I totally agree with all the points you made. But I think it's a problem across multiple biomes, but I think it's especially a problem in the ocean where a lot of these enterprises, just struggle to meet the criteria that funders are looking for. At least they do right now. I'm glad you have all the answers of how to do that.
Karen, would you like to?
Sure, have all the answers. No. Look, I think I think you're absolutely right. The ocean has been, the kind of environmental orphan in the room, and that has left us quite far behind. The opportunity we have, though, is because we've been left far behind, we can learn from some of the mistakes that have been made before. And I think we need to. We need to learn really quickly, though. And this is about moving out of the silos that we are so used to working in, and actually the type of partnerships and collaborations that we need to see, not only in the ocean space, but across from oceans to forests to atmosphere, and think about how we can solve for some of those problems. So you spoke about high-quality blue carbon at the beginning of this conversation, and the blue carbon market is at the moment all over the place. And last year, a group of organizations got together, including Aura, Salesforce, the World Economic Forum, Nature Conservancy, and Conservation International, and built out some high-quality blue carbon principles and guidelines. And the reason for us doing that is to look at, as this market is evolving, what can we learn from the forest space to bring into the ocean space so that we can create a floor below which those investments shouldn't fall, the safeguards and the guardrails. Now we've got to take those and make them practical. And those are our opportunities, which also can help us to crowd in some of the private finance, because in helping to set a level playing field, in providing some of the certainty that's needed both for the private sector and for the signals from the public sector, we're beginning to create that marketplace and that space for investment, to de-risk, to think about all of those elements as we build forward. That's our opportunity. It's also, of course, our challenge. And we need to really, I think, leave here as a cohort of partners advocating for investment into the space, because we don't have long to get to scale. The Maldives Environment Minister said earlier this month, 85 months if we want to stick to the 1.5 degree target is what we've got. Just think about that, 85 months. We've got to add quickly and together.
Yeah, that's quite a countdown that is fast approaching, as you said. And as you said, we need to scale up some of the great initiatives that we talked about to de-risk. And you mentioned something really important, which is that level playing field. And some of the insights that we have from terrestrial systems like forests, absolutely vital. Any other thoughts on SDG 14, why we're not there yet?
Yeah, maybe SDG 14 and more widely, actually, I think we all talked about partnerships, and I would really like to insist on that. Indeed, oceans are a bit out of sight. It's complex. I think it was mentioned a lot in the previous panel, and we really need to join forces. And I would like to give an example of an initiative that we've launched at COP27 with our partners from EBRD and the Union for the Mediterranean to fight pollution in the Mediterranean area. So multi-sector partnership, working together with the beneficiary countries, with other DFIs. And here the idea is really to join forces, to push for policy dialogue that we discussed earlier, the framework that we need to have in place, to provide some financing. And I think nobody could achieve this alone. So we need the governments, we need the financing sector, we need everybody around the table in order to meet these challenges that we have in front of us.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those collaborations and those policy dialogues, and that's also why we see, for example, this summit as being part of a continuation of the progress, because we don't want to have the same conversations all the time. We're building on the conversations that we've had at COP15 as well, not just COP27. Keith, any final thoughts from you in terms of what we need to do in terms of getting to SDG 14 and why we are not there yet, and how can we bridge the gap?
It's a big question, isn't it? I think the panel title is Closing the Finance Gap. We haven't actually talked about what the gap is. Recently there was the Convention on Biological Diversity. Many of you will have seen, came up with a global biodiversity framework that had targets on financing that kind of give us a handle on perhaps the scale of the gap that we're talking about. And the governments, like 190 some governments, committed to filling the gap by $200 billion a year for biodiversity by the year 2030. And of that, $30 billion a year is supposed to come from developed countries to developing. Another unspecified slice will come from domestic budgets, but it leaves a big gap. And even after all the government funding layers in, there's a big gap to be filled by the private sector and by innovative and blended financing solutions. So I think it's been really great to talk about some of these innovations here today.
Amazing. Thanks so much. And I'd really like to thank the panel for an amazing conversation on all these different elements of how to close the gap. Just by way of summarizing some of the findings that and some of the discussions we've had here. I mean, we started with this notion of bankable projects, but it was actually good to get reminded that have you really defined that? And also, the need to actually build that, policy framework, regulatory framework around bankable projects and making them scalable and being able to deliver at speed as well, and having that these innovative tools to help us develop the solutions to actually make projects bankable. We talked about the different, new innovations, the new products, from 5 to 45. That's something that stuck. So there's this opportunity to kind of leverage the different new innovative products that we have in that space, and also the examples and case studies of examples where innovative finance has flown into communities is absolutely incredible. From the examples in Mauritius and Fiji. You mentioned the parametric insurance, whereas microfinance and microinsurance and macroinsurance coming together. Examples from the different impact funds that are being created. And also, all the kind of work that you're also doing in the European Investment Bank to bring, the different players together, different types of financial instruments, the engagement across sectors that we talked about, that we need. Also, the fact that we need to work on that missing middle. We do have a lot of great, startups, a lot of great ideas. And we have a lot of large-scale investors, and we have money there, but we don't really have that focus on the middle. But for scale and to meet SDG 14, we need that. We also need to bring in, traditional finance. We need to make sure that we have natural capital included into the conversation around what is worth financing, and of course, having the public policies in place to incentivize the sustainable blue economy. So thanks a lot again to the panel. It was great to have you, Lisa, Karen, Keith, and Karine. And of course, the conversation continues. So thanks a lot, and hopefully see you soon and discussing how we can improve access to blue finance. Thank you very much.